Welcome back to beautiful Gilas Ner Avram in Sharet Chesed Yerushalayim. So we have a double Parsha this week, Parshas Matos and Masei. We're going to focus on Masei and its connection with this period of time, the 3 weeks, the Bein HaMetzarim, and with all of our lives. I want to start off just with something interesting. I've been, again, looking at Moshe Wolfson's writings a lot recently after he was nifter. He just points out something that we're all familiar with, but I never thought of the, the question mark that should be floating above it. The minhag is, at least in the Ashkenazi kilos, I didn't get the chance to ask a Sephardi Bal Koreh, that when you read in Masei, when you read the Masos, when you read the travels of Am Yisrael, you read it with the same nigun that we read Oz Yosher, right? It's this kind of singing, Vayisu every day, Bar Sinai, Sinai, right? Forgive my throat, etc. But that's basically it. Okay, that when we sing it for Oz Yosher, right? That is this very uplifting, the song of the Geula of Am Yisrael. And here, the Masos and the Midbar, if we think about them, so most of those travels were done when we were, so to speak, in the penalty box, meaning we weren't able to go into Eretz Yisrael right away because of Chet HaMeraglim. And then we spent, 38 years about going around from place to place. That was the creed. And then that generation died in the Midbar, and only the next generation was able to go into Eretz Yisrael. It's also, there's meaning to the way the Parshas work out in our yearly schedule. And the fact that Parshas Masei does come out in the 3 weeks, and that usually the Shabbos that we're Mevarchi Rosh Chodesh Av, which is leading to the heavier part of the 3 weeks even. So what he gets out of it is that we have to remember that all of this is something positive, right? That all of the travels, even the idea of Golus, even travels that Am Yisrael have to do that we don't understand, that those are something which is positive. He says, just like he compares it, he says, the Golus of Am Yisrael among the nations can be compared to the neshama coming into the guf. That we know that when Hashem puts a neshama into a body in a certain time period in the world, that is for a purpose and for a positive purpose. We don't know exactly what Hashem's purposes are. Sometimes we look at a Jewish neshama that's put in a place and we're wondering, what is Hashem thinking, right? He puts it in a far-out place where there's no other Jews to know or to teach it. The parents don't know anything. The child doesn't know anything. But all of that is there with a purpose. Just like in these travels that Am Yisrael did, there are different explanations and mefarshim about the names of the places they were in. The Ramban says, bottom line, these things are a sod. They're a secret. There was something very powerful that Am Yisrael were doing. And it's fascinating to note that the Torah doesn't tell us anything about what was happening then. Aside from this, all those years, we get a little recap of where they went, but we get no reports on what happened. The yeshiva answers, what happens? They learned. You weren't traveling, you learned. You travel, then you learn again. But all these things were an important process. Okay, we'll speak about it a little bit more in a second. Now, Wolfson continues on this comparison of the neshama coming into a guf. He says, when a child is born, we make a simcha. We're not avelim on the fact that the neshama used to be in this ideal existence up by the Kisei HaKavod, and now has to come down into this world, and we have to, some people say a certain Indian, the Shalom Zochar, to console the nefesh a little bit and welcome it into this world. But he says, no, this Yurida is a tzarech aliyah. The coming down into this world is actually the first step of an elevation. So too, Golus. Golus is something which is part of Am Yisrael's travel upwards. It is purposeful. Everything we do in Golus, every station that Am Yisrael went to in Golus, everything we went through is part of our return to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so he says that's why we read it in the nigun of the Shira. He says, just like we had such a song where we were leaving Golus, says so too, when we read Masei, at a time when we're going into Golus, and we're speaking, so to speak, about Am Yisrael's mini Golus in the Midbar, we also sing with the same tune for that. As David HaMelech said, Chesed u'mishpat ashira. Hashem, I sing when I can grasp the chesed you're doing with me, and I sing when it's mishpat, when it's the time of judgment. Okay, with both of them, Chazal explained that bein chesed, bein mishpat ashira, whether I sense the chesed or whether or not I do. Okay, now, Svarim say that these travels really encapsulate, so to speak, the concentrate, the DNA of all of Am Yisrael's travels that are going to be in our history, in our Golos, right? In all of these things, all of them are there. So let's take a look at some things that we can learn from them. The Svarim do bring down from the Zohar HaKadosh that the purpose of Am Yisrael traveling in the Midbar, they were very busy. When it says, right later in Devarim, it describes that Hashem took you through the desert, a place of Nochash, Saraf, Va'akrov, right? Snakes and serpents and scorpions. So the Mefarshim say that doesn't mean just necessarily the wildlife that's there in the Midbar. In fact, right, Chazal say that the Anani Kavod, right, they protected us from the reptiles also, right? We didn't have to worry about those. But spiritually, those things represent negative spiritual forces. Am Yisrael, in each place that they were, in each travel that they were involved in a struggle. Now, some of Farshim, right, the Sod V'Shorosh Avoda has a very long perush on every named place and describing which midah it connects to and what the struggle was. Oh, also that, right, the Matos-Masei eventually end to the end of the journey, the successful end. Some people even say it's a segula to say the Matos-Masei, right, to read these travels. So it's something that they were doing, they were struggling, and it's in the form of masa, of traveling, and also chanoya, of camping. Okay, so there are a few questions that people have about the format of the psukim in this parsha. One is that it starts off, Elam Masei b'nei Yisrael. Now, you know, the travels usually aren't the goal. The goal is where you stop. Where'd you go on your vacation? Well, we took route so-and-so to the airport, and then at the airport we took a shuttle bus. That's where you went. Oh, eventually we got to Hawaii. Right? That's not like that. The master is really, seems to be just this technicality. We've spoken before about the idea of, that's the idea between holchei drachim and ovrei drachim. Holchei drachim value every single step, and they know that it's purposeful. Here, the Nesiya of Am Yisrael, the travels, were an avodah. And the Chanoya, we'll see, is really just a chance to consolidate the gains of your avodah, rest up, and then move on to the next one. Okay, that's why we have this idea of Elam Masei. The title is, these are the travels of Bnei Yisrael, Asher Yotzu Me'eretz Mitzrayim, meaning this was the continuation of the Yetzias Mitzrayim process. Just as right now we're still continuing that process. Okay, it never reached its full fruition. Even though Am Yisrael reached Eretz Yisrael and built the Beis Hamikdash, we haven't got to that final Geula. So our travels from Mitzrayim are still going on. Now, instead of being in that Midbar, Chazal say we're in what's called in the Navi the Midbar Ha'ami, the desert of the nations. And we're traveling through many, many nations. So then we find the phrasing in the Pasuk, Vayichtov Moshe es motzaeim lemaseim. Moshe wrote down their leavings to their travels, al pi Hashem, according to Hashem. And these are their travels to their leaving. Right? He changes the order, motzaeim lemaseim, maseim lemotzaeim. Endless discussions in the Mefarshim as to what they're saying. Let's try to get a little taste of it. The masa, traveling, is what's called yigia. It's called the hard work. Okay, now really, Olam Hazeh, this world, is the world of yigia. It's a world of hard work. Nesivos Yisraelim in the first chapter really explains that. Part of our frustration with life is that we think that life is supposed to be a vacation. And we're very upset that, you know, the tour director is really not providing us with the experience we wanted. But if we realize that this world is about doing and accomplishing, okay, and transforming things. So then we would understand that even the things that are difficult and even the things that we don't understand are designed for us to be able to do that. The chanoya in the midbar, the resting, again, a Jew doesn't live to rest. A Jew rests in order to live. Okay, the chanoya, the Shem Mishmuel compares it to something in Hilchos Shabbos. When a person is carrying on Shabbos, right, so we have the idea of akira and anocha, right, the idea of, let's say, carrying it 4 amos in the Reshus HaRabim. You have to first pick it up, and then you have to put it down, so to speak. What if a person's carrying this heavy thing on his shoulder, and, as he's getting sore a bit, and he stops for a minute to shift it around? That's called lamud lekatek, to shift it around on your shoulder. So there, it's not considered that you put it down, even though usually if your body stops, so we view it that the object stops also. But here, because the stopping is really part of your carrying on, right? Therefore, it's viewed as continued. So too, Am Yisrael in the Midbar, it was a constant state of progress. It was a constant state of winning a battle, right? Cleaning off your armor a little bit, right? Sleeping and getting ready to move on. And that would all be Al Pi Hashem. They understood that whichever challenge they were going to be facing was always Al Pi Hashem. And they waited with anticipation. Certainly they used their time in the Chanoya. Some of the Rishonim would say part of the purpose of giving us these things to see, there weren't that many trips. In 38 years, right? Matos-Masei, 42 travels, not that many. Right? It wasn't like he had them wandering around the desert endlessly, right? They had time where they were there. But the idea was the Masa. Okay, now let's see how this goes beyond the time period that it was in to our time period. As we said, the Sforim bring down that this teaches us. It has the successful transition that Am Yisrael will make through Golus, through every Golus that they will have. And it also has to do with personal Golus. Right? There's a famous statement of the Baal Shem Tov, his grandson, the Degel Machne Efrai V'Sadilko, brings it down. He says, "It's so kol adam miyomi volda," with every person from the day he's born, at shuvo el alomo, until he goes to his next world, he is on this same journey of 42 travels. Right? It's hard for you to spot where each trip is, but he says, no, you're all going to go through them. Birth, Chazal say, is like leaving Mitzrayim, and then you go from travel to travel until you reach your destination. So a person has to understand all of these assorted random factors in life that seem to get you to go places you never thought you were going to go, you wanted to go, in the macro and the micro, whether it's moving someplace or whether it's your plane having to set down in Newfoundland because there was bad weather over New York. All of these things involve your travels in life, but there's more to it. Because as we said, Am Yisrael is also traveling through their 42 travels as they go through history. Your personal travels are not isolated from Am Yisrael's travels. They try to make this more clear. It's not just two things that are going on. Am Yisrael are going through their 42 travels in the Golus. They're going from place to place. They're taking care of things. And when they take care of things, they move on. I'll just tell you a fascinating story. Years ago, for whatever reason, the son can get in trouble. For whatever reason, I ended up spending a Shabbos in Metz in France. Okay, Metz is a very, very famous city for a Jewish community. Named it after a New York sports team, but it's really old, right? And so I needed to stay someplace there. There was a very special Rav Bamberger. They called him Rav Bamberger in French, and he was the Rav of the town. And he was telling me something about the history. He was disappointed that I was a Kohen because there's many big people in the cemetery there, City Yeshua, Shagasarye, many big people. And we know it from the Tosfos, from Rabbi Lezer de Metz. And he told me it wasn't such an easy community to be the Rav of. It was somewhat in the shadow of Strasbourg, which was nearby and is a much bigger, much more successful community. And he was struggling a bit, trying to get it going. And he came up with an idea. I'm going to go to Chutz La'aretz, and I'm going to make a brochure, and we're going to make it a project. Bring Torah back to Metz. Metz was for centuries the kingdom of Torah in that part of Europe. Let us rebuild Torah in Metz. So he went to America. He stopped into Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He showed him his pamphlet. Yaakov said, no, not impressed. He says, why, Rebbe? But Metz was. He said, Metz was. He said, I'm not telling you shouldn't do everything you can for your Kehillah. Do everything you can. But Am Yisrael doesn't have nostalgia. We travel, we do what we have to in a place for 100, for 500, for 1,000 years, and then we move on. We're heading to Eretz Yisrael, right? But we don't have nostalgia for the places that were. Okay? It was an interesting thought, and it's a real picture of how Rabbi Yaakov saw Am Yisrael going through these Matos and going from place to place, accomplishing something with all the challenges that are there, doing what has to be done, and then moving on. So we have that travel of Am Yisrael, and we have my travel, right? I started in Boston, and then I went to Eretz Yisrael, and then I came back to Boston, and then I went here, then I went there, and everybody here has such stories with all sorts of little sub-travels in between. So are those two separate journeys? No. Listen to what says the Be'er Moshe, right? The Azhar of a Rebbe. Azhar of a Rebbe was a giant who, when he came out of Europe, he lived in the Bronx. A very beautiful thing he did. After the Holocaust, there was another Rebbe who managed to survive. He came out with nothing, with the shirt on his back. Azhar of a Rebbe said, take my house, take my shul, take my mispal, my chassid, or whatever, right? Because, I had my time here. I wasn't in the war, right? Then he moved off to Eretz Yisrael to Tel Aviv. It was a beautiful thing to do. He was a giant. It's interesting that Rav, right, the great Baal Musar, who learned in the mirror, when he lists, he always made sure to have a Rebbe. Among the Rebbeim that he listed in the chain was the Azhar of a Rebbe. So he says like this. He says, you have to realize, Kayemes efsharus sheyochid mi Yisrael mashlim umetakin be'inyan hamasos masha'osat tzibur bichlolo. Meaning, I am never just an individual. I am part of and a representative of Am Yisrael. Okay? So therefore, when I have to, end up in Timbuktu for some reason because the plane broke down, so that means a part of Am Yisrael is now taking a journey into Timbuktu and dealing with whatever challenges are there. You may not see. Part of the idea of the Matos-Masei, just like the Torah didn't reveal here what Am Yisrael were going through. So he says the nisyonos that you go through, oftentimes you're not even aware of them, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be such a nisayon. There's a famous story about a guy who was known to be a very angry person. And he came to a Rebbe, and he asked him advice for something. He asked him for a bracha. And as he walked out, the Rebbe told him to wait in the outside room for a bit. He called in the gabbai, and he kind of left the door open a crack. He said, I want you to do everything you can to get that man out there angry. He's got an anger problem. Provoke him. Okay, the gabbai's a good chassid. He comes out there. He says, what are you doing sitting here? I don't even like to see your face. And the man's just simply smiling and laughing and smiling and laughing. Eventually the Rebbe calls him in again, and he says, it's interesting. People had said you have a problem with anger, and the gabbai there said so many insulting things to you, and you didn't react. He says, Rebbe, I got to tell you, I heard you tell him. I knew it was just a test. And he says, every time it's just a test. It's just, but that's the thing. If you're told what it is, then it's not so much of an nisayon. So a person goes through and does it. So this is, each of us are representing Am Yisrael. Our little struggles that we have when I'm dealing with a challenge in my workplace or in someplace else, when it's there, that is not just me, that is Am Yisrael going through their travels. Because I'm connected. I'm part of all Am Yisrael. All of Am Yisrael is part of me. Right? He says, this is what Chazal said in the Medrash Shir Ashirim. He says, right, Echad mikem goyle, right, it said, when it says the Melech HaMashiach can come to Am Yisrael, right, b'chodesh hazeh atem nigalim, but people are going to say, look, Kvar Nishba, Kodesh Baruch Hu shemishabdeinu b'shivim umos, didn't Kodesh Baruch Hu say he's going to put us into the goals, we're going to be subjugated by 70 nations? So he says, the Mashiach will give two answers. He says, number one, Echad mikem gole lebarbaria. One of you, at some point, is going to end up having to move to Barbaria, wherever that is, place of the barbarians. And Echad mikem gole lesamatria. And one of you is going to end up going to Sumetria. Dome kamoshi gelisim kulchem. You're the representative of all Am Yisrael. It's as if Am Yisrael was subjugated to that nation, just you. V'lo od, and it works in the other areas as well. Sha'malchus azos mechateves tirunya b'chol umma v'umma. Meaning that one kingdom will send out anti-Semitic, right, propaganda to all sorts of other countries, right? So therefore, he says it can be, right, that in one country, Chazal say that Amalek, in the battles of Avraham Avinu, the king called Sidol Melech Goyim was the king of Amalek, right? Why is he called Melech Goyim, the king of nations? Shesholachas trunya b'chol umos neged Yisrael, that it sends out Lashon Hara to all the nations against Am Yisrael. Right? You find nations in the world, you wonder, why are they anti-Semitic? The protocols of the elders of Zion apparently have huge amounts of editions printed in Japan. Not that many Jews in Japan, right? What and why it's there, but anti-Semitism travels and it goes places. So therefore, if a German, right, sends out news about Am Yisrael to Japan, so to speak, and a Jew in Japan, therefore, it's as if he's being subjugated by Germany at that point, or by the others. So he says, just by living your lives, you're going to end up being subjugated and affected by all the Shivim Umos of the world. This official Schechter was a Talmud of Rav Wolfson, said that Rav Wolfson would mention that it's clear to him that the huge explosion of technological innovation that happened now is because we're close to the Geula, and all of these tikkunim have to happen very quickly. So suddenly, right, the world has become almost a much smaller place. We're talking to people in Bangladesh. We're traveling here. We're traveling there. Jews from all places are meeting each other and learning from each other. Non-Jews from all places are coming to other places and providing us with different challenges, and we have to go through. And all these things are playing out as we have it. Okay, so this is what we have to understand in our lives, in our world. Now, a little bit, what is the nature, what type of work are we doing when we're traveling? So Nesivos Shalom says that when it describes this process of vayisu vayachanu, so he says, again, it gets tricky. I'm not good with math, but the Sforim say that the Membeis Masos really correspond to the 49 permutations of the 7 midos, where the last 7 are just each of the ones to fill it in, right? Meaning, anyways, it works somehow. But the idea is just like in Sfiras Omer, when we talk about these 49 midos, when you're going from Tuma to Tahara, so every midah has its Tomei side, there's Chesed to Tuma. So you have to leave the gates of the Tuma type of Chesed and enter the Chesed of Kedusha. So that's Vayisu Vayachanu. That's what they were doing at the time. Each place, they had to deal with some midah and the negative form of the midah. They had to overcome the negative form and then enter the form of Kedusha that was there. Okay, so this is the idea of Motzaeim L'Maseim. He said first you have to leave the negative, and then you travel to the good, what's called Sur Meira V'Aseh Tov. But why do we have the opposite order? Why do we have Motzaeim, Masaeim L'Motzaeim? He says because, and the Shalom Rebbe writes this a few times in the Nesivos Shalom, that even though it's clear the playbook is Sur Meira V'Aseh Tov, leave the bad and do good. And we can understand logically because when you're involved in bad, that's obviously going to contaminate the good you're trying to do or stop you from enjoying or really experiencing the good. But most people aren't motivated to leave the bad until they've tasted the good. Right? Why? Right? Stop doing that stuff. Why? Right? Because then you can do really good stuff. What kind of good stuff? You can sing L'Chadori on Friday night. It doesn't. So first, he says there has to be an idea. There is a way also of Maseim, right? That you just travel and jump and grab onto Aseh Tov and you taste it, and then that helps you get out as well. So let's just finish with a couple of hopeful notes. One is the Kotzker Rebbe said that in the Membeis Masos, all the miracles that happened to Am Yisrael and all of their Golios, right? Even though, just like we don't see what happened when the Torah tells us those 42 journeys, they went from here, they camped there, went from there, camped there. What happened? We don't know. He says, guess what? Miracles were happening then. Miracles are happening to you. They're all the years of the Golos. That's why it says, La'osin niflos gedolos levado. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does wonders for him alone. Only he knows what's happening. But, says, don't think it's never going to be coming out. Kol ma'oros ha-Golos, all the events of the Golos, holchim v'nichtavim b'shamayim. They're all being written down in the Shamayim. La'osid lovo yechuba b'sefer miyuchad. A new sefer is going to come out. There's a story of all of those travels and all of the Goliaths, of the nation and of our individuals. And that's being written constantly by all of us. And it's something that'll be a beautiful book that we'll be able to do. And the last thought, just that the Shem Mishmuel mentions, right, there's a famous medrash here that talks about different things that you can only get. You only nikne b'yisurim, Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam Haba. So he says, if they had to go through 40 years in the desert, and they got Eretz Yisrael, that they came in with Yoshua, it was never the full Eretz Yisrael that was promised to Avram Avinu. He says, our Golos of thousands of years, and murder and suffering and all these things, you can only imagine what the Eretz Yisrael we're going to have is like. He says, exponentially greater than anything that we see in Sefer Yoshua that was there. So keep that in mind as we keep traveling. Have a wonderful week.